So what is at the core of who I am as a professional? How authentic do I express that? And now we're to, how do I find people that can relate to that? I only know of one way. And the only way to find if people resonate with who you really are is you have to be who you really are.
Hello and welcome to the Days of Change podcast. I had so many fantastic guests already, but today is a historical day for this show. Today I feel like David Letterman, where like in his show, my next guest needs no introduction. Suddenly Barack Obama or George Clooney enters the studio. Well, it's not Obama or Clooney I have with me today, but if you have been in the change management business for a while, there are a handful of names which everybody knows because they have influenced our discipline unlike anybody else. Of course, there's John Kotter and Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer. Daryl Conner, my guest of today, is part of this pantheon. He talked about change long before others picked it up and made it a trend. His life and his work provides material for a whole season of this podcast, and I'm afraid I will overload this episode with all I want to know from him. Daryl is not only a great resource for all of us who work in the field, he's also one of the finest persons I've met. He's humble and supportive, which makes him a great leader and role model in this ego-driven world. In 1993, he published his book, Managing at the Speed of Change, which is today as fresh as it was 25 years ago. That was about the time when I myself got into the field, but we met only later, about a few years ago. I plan to focus our conversation on one of the main questions he asked, and he provided wonderful answers for that in the last years. How do we show up as facilitators, teachers, consultants, coaches, and human beings who want to make a difference to the world? How can we develop to practitioners who have a high impact on the client system we are working in? But before, I want to revisit his extraordinary life and career and look at 30 years in change management with a view on the recent development in the field of digital and agile transformation. Who would be a better witness for describing what is happening right now? If you want to listen to other episodes of the Days of Change podcast, please visit our website at changedays.com/podcast. Daryl, what should I say? It's a great honor for me to having you on this podcast. I'm really looking forward to a great conversation.
Holger, thank you for your gracious introduction, and I really have been looking forward to just chatting with you. It's you and I don't get to do that enough, as far as I'm concerned. So I've been really up for this time together.
Daryl, what would you consider as your greatest achievements in life? What are you proud of?
I am. I don't know about pride. That one probably doesn't. The word pride, Holger, sort of implies maybe that I'm at the center of something. What I am most grateful for, I can tell you that, is the opportunity to that opened up for me to find my own center, to find what I believe my life is about. I feel very fortunate to be able to identify that. And secondly, to find a way to be in service to others by applying that. I'm just immensely grateful and literally give thanks for both of those each day. So I think rather than feeling like I'm proud of something, I feel just incredibly fortunate to be able to understand what it is I have to say and to find an audience that would be willing to listen.
And as I said in my introduction, you're a very humble person. How long did it take you to find your center?
I'm a very late bloomer, Holger. Looking back, I can tell you that I was trying to find my center probably much of my life. not doing a particularly good job of it, I would add. I don't think, I know for a fact the center did not emerge for me until I was in my early 50s. And I hit a point in my life where nothing was working at every turn. Whatever paradigm I had set up for myself that had in the past seemed to work pretty well, none of that was working. And it was the first time, Holger, that my experience was I had kind of taken pride in my life about whenever I would face something, some kind of adversity, I always thought of it as I would bounce off of it. I would, bounce into, another mode. It was the first time that I bounced in instead of out. I didn't bounce towards something else. I actually sort of pulled in and found a level of introspection that quite frankly I had never experienced before. And so it's the point at which that turning occurred is actually there's been all kinds of gradual evolution since that point, but the actual point of the turn is pretty distinct, is pretty specific for me.
Can you remember a story or an experience at that time when you started to take the turn? So when you were turning inwards, what happened when you suddenly saw that you didn't have the impact that you wanted to have?
Well, I was lost. I couldn't make sense out of what was going on around me. What the buttons that I used to push just weren't working. What I learned about myself was those buttons were ego buttons, and so whatever my ego had done to get me that far, it just wasn't working anymore. And so the first part of the experience, Holger, was just a sense of dismay and what's going on, and I think because I didn't have an answer, I think that's what pulled me in. And I can tell you, I was extremely fortunate to in the midst of that lostness, I had the good fortune of coming across Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now.
Right.
Book. It was so timely for me, and to this day, I think of that and the spiritual journey that opened up for me. I just am immensely grateful that I found a way to I found language, I found a framework that helped me understand how to begin to create a different path.
And obviously that led you later to developing the program we will be talking about later in this show, the Raising Your Game. This must be connected, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely connected. Yeah, let's come to that a little bit later. I want to have a few biographical points of your past covered before you started in the early 70s. I mean, long before somebody talked about change management. You started off by looking for answers to a question which you described in your book, which is probably now still one of the most pressing one. The question was, are there patterns to how people respond when their work lives are disrupted? I mean, that's happening now every day with everybody. How did you arrive at that question at a time when corporations seemed like monuments of stability?
Or at least trying to be.
Right.
There's another piece of just good fortune here, Holger. I had a very brief but meaningful encounter with Alvin Toffler, and I've learned that a lot of people aren't familiar with his work, but Toffler was, one of the early futurists, and he wrote the book Future Shock.
Yeah.
And his premise was that as a species, we have the capacity to create more than we can metabolize. And he was predicting something. It hadn't happened yet, but he said, if we keep this up, we're going to drown in our own change. And not only was his book meaningful, but I actually had some time with him, and I was so struck by. I came out of a clinical psychology background, so I was accustomed to seeing patterns in individuals and their change and efforts and families. But it was through his work that I began to think about institutional patterns. So is there a way to describe the patterns associated with successful change versus those that are less than successful? And I was just really curious about that. And so that's what it was really. I give him credit for just opening up the question for me. Is there a way? Because I knew if he was right, I thought he was, but it was a prediction. But I thought if this guy is right, and our species is headed toward more change than we can deal with, we don't have a process for that. We don't. Now, clearly, there were I didn't invent change, right? So clearly there were people and organizations that were successfully navigating change. So it wasn't that, was it possible? It was, how are they doing that? And what I was curious about is organization A doing it in a way that reflects what organization B is doing? Because they're both doing it. And are there patterns to the organizations that aren't succeeding with their changes? And so that was that curiosity that really started that. I'll tell you, Holger, I was so naive. I remember thinking, well, that'll be a good 6-month investigation. There's probably something there.
I mean, I'm trying to research the history of change management, and I tried that several times just 2 weeks ago when I prepared for a facilitation course, and obviously your name pops up all the time. I mean, that's clear, and a few other people, but there is not really something like a real good history of change management. For me, it partly came out of project management, and people who were applying the tools of project management were seeing that projects didn't work or didn't work out as they were planned. Who else except you was around in, let's say, the 70s and 80s, and who was then there talking about this discipline of change?
Well, first, I'm embarrassed to say, but I did not have access or awareness of the change management, of the change project work. So unfortunately, I didn't have access to that until much later. I would say the earliest mentor for me at a professional level about this was another just incredibly wonderful opportunity for me is I had some training by Virginia Satir. And I mean, she's, again, a lot of people don't know her, but she was just this amazing woman. Now, she was a family therapist, and what I got introduced to was systems. She refused to see an individual. She wouldn't meet with the alcoholic. She would only meet with the family, and she treated that alcoholism as a family dynamic, and it was just so powerful for me. And of course, again, coming from the clinical side, then there was another point of, she had established some patterns around how systems deal with change. And so I would definitely, point to her as some early work. The exposure I did have, since I didn't know anything about project management back in those days, is there was, not only had change management not evolved, but there was this new emerging crazy field called organizational development, and it was brand new, and within it didn't yet have a focus on change, but it had a focus on health. Instead of always just fixing problems, it had an element to it of how do we expand the health that's already there. And the origins of that, from my standpoint anyway, was Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers is one of the early pioneers in humanistic psychology. And the whole point of humanistic psychology is it was sort of a third element. Instead of clinical psychology, fixing people, or research psychology, there was this new field of how can we help people to self-actualize? How can we help them to lift themselves up, not from dysfunction, but from a good solid foundation. And so all of these were, to me, disparate and hadn't collected into anything that would resemble a discipline, but they certainly influenced me. And so my first tribe, Holger, was, since change management didn't exist, my first tribe was organizational development.
That's really interesting what you're saying, Daryl, because when I got into that whole field, that was 25 years ago, and I was at least as naive as you were, because I had no idea and had no psychological background. I even didn't have a business background. So when I got into it 25 years ago, and I started to read everything which was around, and then I was publishing change management toolbook on the early internet and things like that, I didn't make a distinction between organizational development and change management, and I'm still not doing it. But then when I went to the States and meet the colleagues over there in the change management field, I was quite surprised that there was this clear separation. So, for example, if you go to the change management conferences, even now, you meet very few organizational development practitioners, and the other way around. That's a little bit different here in continental Europe, and I could never understand why the two disciplines wouldn't totally merge.
Well, I would like to expand the indictment further.
Please.
There are three communities that in the States, and you're right, this is much less true in Europe and in Australia, the communities there. But in the States, there are three very distinct tribes that not only don't interact, but don't think very highly of each other. Organizational development, change management, and project development, project management. Those three disciplines, rather than seeing how much they have in common, they built these walls around each other and sort of tolerate each other, which just doesn't make any sense to me, because quite frankly, none of us have got the answer. And the more we can integrate into these, to me, they're not different disciplines. They're different expressions of the same discipline. Where all three of these communities, to me, Holger, are change practitioners. To me, a change practitioner is not somebody just with change management focus. Any professional that has a discipline, I don't care what the discipline is, but if you have a discipline and you're applying that discipline in service to enable others to change, then to me, you're part of the community. And so yes to the firewall that you mentioned, but I would even add the third one. And I believe it is to the clients we serve, whether we're outside consultants or internal practitioners, those we serve are not properly served when we only address a single piece. Now, I am not a project management specialist by any means. I don't swim in the lane of organizational development anymore, but to be able to acknowledge and respect those disciplines and look for ways to serve a client in such a way so that these other disciplines are reflected and brought in, that to me would be a plus for our community.
Yeah, and the problem starts with the words. I can accept that projects can be managed. I cannot accept that change can be managed, and I cannot accept that organizations can be developed. If you apply modern concepts of complexity, this notion is just crazy. And that's probably one of the problems. If I look at the change management community, for example, they're thinking very much in project management terms. So you have to have point A, and then you have to develop a campaign and things like that. totally disregarding the complexity of the human being and of social systems.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And because of that mindset, what it's led to, let me narrow back down to the change management community. I personally am very concerned about how addicted the profession is coming to certifications. We're cranking out technicians, not artists. And by no means am I suggesting that we should bypass a solid grounding in methodology and concepts. Of course, we have to have all that, but if we don't see that there's also a mastery path, there's a technician part of our practice, and then there is the much more of respecting the complexity that you're talking about. Of course, there's some cut and dried black and white aspects to change management, and
Sure.
many clients, that's just what they need. But others they're looking for a partner to help them navigate mystery, and there are no answers, and they have to struggle rather than apply a cookbook. And my concern, Holger, is we're not preparing our profession is not preparing those practitioners, in my opinion, to respect the complexity, know that there's not always answers, and yet feel like that we've got something to contribute that's really valuable in that respect.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you. I'm trying in the trainings I give in my seminars, I'm focusing on mindset and attitude, and not so much on tools, because yeah, you're right, it's good to have some tools and methodologies, but once you have learned a few and mastered some of them, you can take a book or look up in the internet. If you have the right mindset and attitude,
Yep.
Tools and methodologies are not the problem.
Yep.
Daryl, there's another thing I'm struggling with for a long time, and I just wrote an angry article last week, don't know whether you saw it, where I said, please ditch the word resistance from your vocabulary, because I'm really fed up with this word resistance, which is used as a weapon. Yeah, it's a weapon used by the C-suite or HR or even politicians, which says, we are right, you are wrong, we have the answer, and you must change. I've met so many middle managers who really got angry at that mindset, because they are blamed for not changing and for change not moving ahead. Some call them even the permafrost of organizations. Well, they are the ones who really hold the organizations together. What do you think about this?
So I treat resistance only with its counterpart. And so the domain we're talking about, how I approach it, Holger, is I talk about the need for resolve. And there's two aspects to my resolve to change. One is the degree to which I'm drawn toward it. Let's call that commitment. And there's the degree to which it's fearful and scary, and I retreat from it. And so the combination of those two forces in me have to be managed for my own resolve to change something I want to change about myself, or if I'm a CEO and I aspire to move this organization in a certain direction, then I have to be attentive to both sides of those. Now, where I get particularly uneasy and just frankly not willing to participate is you invoke the right language to me. If I'm the CEO, and historically, Holger, this organization has been green, and for whatever reason, let's assume it's even a good reason, that the board and I have decided that green is no longer really viable. We need to be a red culture instead of a green culture. And that's what they're paying me to do, and that's what our market wants to. All that's fine. That's a business decision. But to come to you and say, okay, so Holger, we're going to be red now, and there's something wrong with you if that's not what you want to do. That's where, to me, A, it doesn't work to take that approach, and B, it crosses a moral, ethical line for me. So what does make sense for me is for the organization to determine that we need to go in a different direction for whatever reason, and here it is. So since we already invited you into this in the future, we're going to hire people, Holger, that have a predisposition for red, because that's the direction we're going in. But we have not only an obligation to you, it just makes good business sense to give every opportunity to you to make that transition. But the transition requires, let's say it's a cultural transition. So that means that not only do we need to behave in a different way, but we actually have to shift some of our mindsets. To provide you with the guidance and coaching and support to enable you to make that transition, if two things are true, makes a lot of sense for me. Number one, is that a transition you have at this point in your life, at this point in your career? Is that a transition that you aspire to? Is that something that works for you? And secondly, and this is particularly important to me, even if you want to, Holger, you may not have a predisposition for red. You came here when we were another color. We rewarded you for that. And now we're saying we're going to move in. You even if you want to do that, you may not have the DNA for it. So to me, the first obligation, both from a business standpoint and an ethical standpoint, is to do everything possible to give you an opportunity to move in that direction if you have the predisposition, if that's something you want to do. If not, however, the organization has made a decision, and so we are going to move in that direction. And so if it doesn't work for you, either because you lack the ability or the willingness or whatever, then we need face-saving mechanisms for you to exit. Resistance can't get translated into something's wrong with you. Resistance, as I'm describing it, is it's not a match for you where we're going. Now, let me add one more thing. My work has shifted in the last few years. So I would have said the same thing, Holger, if we were talking about corporations that were for profit was what they were going for. But let me put it into today a more meaningful context. Most of my time now is spent with international NGO organizations. So Doctors Without Borders and Habitat for Humanity and World Vision, those are my clients now. And so they're having to make some radical changes in order to serve who they're trying to serve. They're trying to get clean water in Africa. They're trying to get girls out of sex slavery. They're trying to build homes. They're trying to literally save lives. And because of a whole range of reasons, they're having to do it different now than they did in the past.
Absolutely.
So it's very legitimate to say, as an organization, we've got to do this. What's not legitimate, in my view, is to say, Holger, something's wrong with you if you don't want to do that.
I totally agree with you. The world of organizations and our discipline is changing, and I wanted to come to that, and you gave me a wonderful prompt now. Because if you look at the field, how it has changed over the last 30 years since you began, how much of what you and others described at that time is still applicable. And some things are, of course, because human beings are human beings. But then again, we have this age of rapid digital transformation. We have the agile movement spilling into all organizations. I mean, I keep saying in every second conversation, I don't remember such a golden time for consultants because so many organizations are crying for help. But apart from that, human beings are human beings and systems are systems. What do you think is different now? And what do you do different from what you have done, let's say, 20 years ago?
My response to that is I think, not consistent with where most of our profession is going, because first of all, I completely agree that the volume, momentum, and complexity of disruptive change is accelerating dramatically. And so I'm totally on board with how this is an unprecedented period. And because of that, let's go back to, I'm a student of patterns. So because of that, my assumption was, okay, there's going to be some different dynamics that unfold here with lean and agile being applied to change management or the speed, whatever. So my bias was that what is different about us? And although I respect a lot of the writing in our field, Holger, that would suggest otherwise, I can't find it yet. I can find that we're doing things differently. Agile applied to our field, I think, is a wonderful innovation, but to me, that innovation has to do with the methodologies we're using, not the dynamics the methodologies are being applied to. So I can't tell you that there is no difference now at the dynamic level, at the underlying pattern level. I can't tell you, Holger, that there is no difference now versus before. I can only tell you I haven't been able to identify a difference. And so, I'm open to it, and I'm always intrigued when people in the change field want to talk about it or write about it. But so far, what I like neuroscience, I'm completely intrigued with all that, but I don't see it as uncovering a different underlying framework about how our species operates. I see it as a wonderful new tool as we deal with those dynamics. So I'm afraid I got to claim that I haven't found an answer to what you're asking me.
Yeah, and I agree with you absolutely. The underlying patterns are obviously the same. They will remain the same or shift very, very slowly, probably over decades or centuries or something like that. The methodologies are different, and I'm very appreciative of the new methodologies which came in over the last 10, 20 years, or the agile stuff and things like that. But what I see as the main difference, that's really very nice coming along, is that all the things we talked about already 10 or 20 years in our circles at our conferences, what we tried to teach to organizations and they didn't want to buy it, all the stuff of a different style of leadership. There is no excuse now for bad leadership anymore. Probably there was never, but now bad leadership is really uncovered immediately, because you see immediately the results of bad leadership, and people are demanding good leadership. They're demanding transparency. The markets are demanding transparency, and all this kind of stuff. So that's why I find it quite an exciting time.
Okay. So then I wasn't interpreting the question at that level. I was kind of going to the deeper underlying dynamics. And what I hear you referring to, this is an oversimplification, but I think to me you're referring to the receptivity of our work.
Right.
Is dramatically different today than it was. I mean, in the early 70s, I couldn't get anybody even interested in having a conversation about this. So you're absolutely right. There's a very different receptivity. And by the way, I don't think it's simply because we've been preaching this sermon for a long time. Yes, I think that's had its impact. But I believe the biggest difference in receptivity, Holger, is there's more scar tissue now. There's more leaders that have either bought or built an absolutely correct transformational change. There was no doubt in their mind, this is the right thing to do, and it faltered. And that's happened enough times when more and more leaders have come to, wait a second, there must be something else here other than simply finding the right answer. I guess we have to help navigate people to embrace that answer. And that mindset, whereas you and I would consider that pretty basic, that mindset, the shift in that direction is a fundamental shift in terms of receptivity. And I'll give you a classic example. In the corporate arena, I wouldn't say that it's by any means saturated with change management. You still have some organizations that are relatively new and late into the game, and they're just now picking up change dynamics, and that's fine. But the vast majority of organizations at least lean in the direction of what you're talking about in terms of receptivity, Holger, if not have a whole cadre of internal practitioners that have been certified. So, but that's in the corporate arena, whether it be in the States or any other country. What I learned a few years ago is there's another sector, the civil society sector, the nonprofits, the NGOs. That sector, Holger, it has virtually had no exposure to this profession. And it's in the midst of dramatic fundamental change. And so the combination of the change they're going through and having no history with it could be that they're not interested. I found exactly the opposite. It is such a rich field of application that any listener that has even the slightest inclination to applying the change craft to a charitable, nonprofit, NGO, I strongly encourage you to pursue that, whether it's pro bono, whether you charge, that's all up to you. But that sector is incredibly ready to not just intellectually embrace, but actually apply much of what our discipline has developed the last few years. So, in my opinion, the planet is in trouble, and our species is in trouble, and these organizations have some important answers. So, I hope some of your listeners might be a little interested in where might they apply the craft in a very receptive environment. Well, the civil society sector, I think, is one of them.
There's also another sector which I'm discovering now, which also is in need of a lot of change facilitation, which are the startups, or let's say the startups which have grown to a certain size, and they suddenly realize that also their culture needs to change. They need to maybe introduce some structures, not necessarily the classical structures. They discover the same human and system patterns that other organizations have. So that's also a very exciting sector I'm currently working in.
Absolutely.
Let us move to what I wanted to be the core of our conversation. We have spent already like 40 minutes, so I definitely want to spend another 15 or 20 minutes on that, because this is really what you have known for the last years, and this is how we met, which is your program, which runs under the slogan Raising Your Game, and we have touched upon it already earlier in that conversation. So we talked already how you came up with this concept out of personal experience. So let me start with a question. What characterizes an exceptional practitioner?
Well, if it's okay, Holger, let me provide a little context. I continue to look for patterns, and so I started another research project several years ago. Very informal, very non-rigorous, but nonetheless, in my opinion, it has surfaced some interesting perspectives. So I went to leaders who were spending money hiring change practitioners. Now remember, I have a broad definition of change practitioners. So yes, change management people, but HR, I don't care, anybody who's using a discipline. But it was obviously heavily weighted toward the human side. So I went to mostly CEOs, and I said, all right, you're spending money on this profession. What kind of value are you getting? And the results over time were pretty revealing to me. 25%. So the question is, what value are you getting from the change profession? 25% said no value at all. I have these people are useless. Keep them out of my office. I'm sorry I ever spent money on them. 25%, much higher than I expected. 65% of the time, the answer was, well, I'm really glad they're here. These are good, solid people. They're really helping us. Whenever I need something, they show up, they deliver it, no complaints. I'm getting my money's worth. 65% of the time. However, they would put a caveat in there. The 65%ers would put this caveat. I'm really glad they're here. Now, I don't see them as strategic resources, But anytime we have a tactical, something, I'm glad they're here. Only 10% of the time did I hear a senior leader say, I'm never going into a major change without this person surgically attached to my hip. This is my business partner. This is a key resource for me. Only 10% of the time. So I started digging into what is that about? What's going on with that 10%? And many things surfaced, but to the question you're asking, what began to get clear was these leaders, they didn't use the language I'm about to use. I had to find a way to catalog what I was hearing. But basically they were saying, well, there's two things I get from these 10%ers. I ended up calling them what they do and who they are. These 10% practitioners were exceptionally good with their tools and techniques. I don't mean that they were certified. They were not technicians. They were exceptionally powerful in their interpretations and their diagnostics and their creative interventions. All of that came underneath what we do as a profession. But the leaders then that are getting value, high value, said there's something else here. I ended up calling it not what we do, but who we are. And what they were describing is these practitioners went beyond simply being exceptionally good with their methodology. They were infusing into the methodology something that leaders didn't know how to articulate it, but there was something like very unique about these people are very bold, they're very confrontive, but in a way that I can really use. They're bringing insights. So I kept digging into that, and I had to invent some or come up with some language, Holger, because no one was using any language that was consistent. So the language I finally fell on was that these practitioners were not simply exceptionally good with their tools and techniques. They were bringing character and presence to the relationship. And the leaders, though they couldn't articulate it necessarily, the leaders found value in that, deep value in that. And so character, and so think of what we do as the linear part of our work. That's the technician part of our work, and we got to be good at that. And the artistic side is who we are. And as practitioners, if we only rely on what we do, there's a risk of becoming a commodity. Because, Holger's got a tool and Daryl's got a tool. Okay, they're both good tools. I could use either one of them. Maybe they're both using the same tool. So what's distinctive about Holger? Why would I rather work with Holger than Daryl? What is it that? Well, we tend to call it chemistry or whatever. Well, I'm trying to dig into it, and what I'm saying is Holger is bringing a presence, and that's informed by a character, some DNA, and he's adding value to the tools and techniques by incorporating that into his work with his clients that Daryl's not. And so that has eventually over the years led to, we now have Conner Academy that doesn't deal with tools and techniques. It only deals with this character and presence, and how can we incorporate that into the change work we do.
And that's really fantastic what you're saying. The last podcast I recorded was with Mary Alice Arthur, who is an incredible woman, also a frequent guest on the Berlin Change Days. She teaches storytelling and she teaches the art of hosting, and she has an incredible presence as very few other people. And she said in the last podcast exactly the same. She said there are two different practitioners. They use the same tools, but one of them has a dramatically different impact on the system because of their presence. So how can we as practitioners nurture presence, our own presence?
Well, there are ways to do it, but let me pop the bubble quickly here. I believe before we get to how can we foster a presence that would be influential, Holger, let's go to whether or not it's even possible to do it. And here's what I mean. My experience is that without a predisposition for this 10% work, by predisposition, I mean an innate leaning in that direction, an intuition, an instinct to, for example, be brutally honest with a client about what's really going on rather than water down my recommendations so that they don't freak out. That tendency is completely consistent with the 10%ers. They're standing on their truth as they make their diagnosis or the recommendations, whereas 65%ers tend to be much more cautious. Well, you know, if we take your question and refine it a bit, Holger, we could be saying, well, how do we teach people to be that honest? And what I'm saying is, Holger, I've never had any success teaching people to be honest. What I have had success with is if there's a predisposition for that level of candor that has been covered over with caution. There's been all kind of messages that you've been given, maybe all your life, that you shouldn't be that way. If there's something in there, then we can help you pull away what is inhibiting you. But Holger, if that predisposition for candor is not in you, I can't pour it in. So I would start with whether or not there is a predisposition. Last week, I was in Vail, Colorado with about 100 consultants. They were all from a single organization, and they'd asked me to come talk about this issue about character and presence. And you know, I had to warn them. I said, look, I'm not here to make you feel good, okay? I'm not here to convince you that you should be a 10%er. I don't know, but I can tell you what, the math doesn't work out if we all think we're going to be 10%ers, okay? The math doesn't work. So I'm not trying to encourage people to be something you're not. I'm trying to say, just be honest with yourself. Do you have the predisposition for being exceptionally good with your tools and bold about who you really are and incorporate that? Not that you're necessarily doing it all that well, but if that is a leaning you have, then Holger, there's absolutely some things we can do. There's even exercises you can go through to help determine, how am I holding myself back? How would I bring myself forward? Here's the real question. Not only how do I better understand the core of who I am, I'm calling that character. Not only can I be more authentic about the expression of that expression I'm going to refer to as presence. I also think of character and presence, Holger, as a package. Holger has a package, and the part of his package that deals with tools and techniques, yeah, a lot of people have that part. No one else has the Holger character and presence. Once he puts those two together, he's now in some unique space. Now the question is, all right, where does he take that package? Because if Holger takes his exceptional skills with his unique character and presence and randomly applies that, you're going to have a whole lot of clients going, well, that doesn't work for me. Holger has to go to the third step and actually find clients that would value him for being who he is. That's where your 10% works, is when I understand the core of who I am, I boldly bring that forward, and I do that with people who value me for that package, and that's where you have disproportionate level of influence.
In your program, Raising Your Game, you ask this great question: how do I find the clients who resonate with my character and presence? Can you please elaborate a little bit more on this? I mean, what can I do? And I know that you use wonderful metaphors like playing your music and finding the crowd who's listening to my music. What are little tips or tricks to find out what is my music? It's not that easy to be totally honest with yourself.
No. How do you find an audience that wants your music? You're starting at the right place. What is my music? Most of the practitioners I work with, Holger, have spent at a minimum, they have spent their professional career and most of them have spent their entire lives adjusting to people saying, okay, that part of your character, that's good. This part of you, no, you need to get rid of that. This part of you will be acceptable and help you move forward. That part of you, you need to hide. So the sum total of all that has left us going, well, like, what's at the core of who I am? I don't even really know that yet. And if I can't get there, how can I authentically bring that forward? So the first step is to go to the core of who you are. And I was in a conversation earlier this week with a practitioner that is pursuing all of this, and his question was, or actually he came to this meeting I had, he had identified some characteristics that he thought were at his core, and his DNA character, if you will. And I thought, I know him, and I've worked with him. I said, yeah, probably. I think this is a good start. But let me offer another perspective. You're trying to identify what your core is, and I applaud you for that. I would encourage you to do that. There's another angle. Take a look at what you're not. Explore what doesn't fit at your core as well. Michelangelo is credited with saying, the way I sculpt these things is I see what's in there, and then I take away the part of the marble that is inhibiting others seeing what I see. So as we explore who we are, Holger, we need to see, am I that? But let's also look for things that I'm not. Going back to this Vail, Colorado presentation, at a certain point, a woman held up her hand and she said, I think, this is toward the end of the day we were spending, she said, I think I understand what you're saying, and I don't want to do that. I don't think I'm predisposed to. You're talking about that level of candor, Daryl, is very risky, and I just don't think that I'm calibrated for that. And I just said, thank you so much for coming forward, because I'm not trying to talk you into it. What I'm trying to suggest is that if there's somebody in this audience that feels like what I'm talking about is at their core, then the process is, how do I uninhibit myself? How do I liberate myself to be who I am, rather than try to pretend to be something I'm not? And so the first step is to get really clear about who we are as practitioners. Holger, there are a lot of personal growth implications to what you and I are talking about, but I'm talking about professional development. So this is, what are we learning about ourselves that can be valuable to clients that we work with? So what is at the core of who I am as a professional? How authentic do I express that? And now we're to, how do I find people that can relate to that? I only know of one way. And the only way to find if people resonate with who you really are is you have to be who you really are. To me, you are a classic example. From even before I met you, Holger, when it was just something that I had read about you, and then when we talked, and then certainly, when I went to Berlin days, you bring your full self forward. My experience of you is you bring your full self forward, and the responsibility for whether there's a good match or not is, quite frankly, on my side, not yours. You appear to be dedicated to being who you are, and when that provides value, you're happy to be a part of that mix. But if it doesn't provide value, it doesn't lead you to believe you should be less of who you are. That's what I'm talking about.
Thank you very much. I think that's quite a fair and frank description of how I feel who I am. And obviously, since the wonderful Brené Brown talked about vulnerability, we know that being vulnerable is an important part of the game. And I think I knew that intuitively before Brené Brown started to talk about it, but obviously since she talks about it, I embrace that fully.
What she does for us around vulnerability is it's a great example I was talking about. It's hard for me to believe it, but I've sent clients, to listen to one of her TED Talks, or now she's got the HBO special. I've sent clients, to me that's a resource. I've sent them to them, and they come back going, yeah, well, okay, that's kind of interesting. And it's not that they're bright people. There was no predisposition in them for vulnerability. When she talks to you, she's providing a language that flames a spark in you, and you're able to bring something forward. She didn't give you an ability to be vulnerable. She gave you a way to legitimize being who you are. And that's what I'm talking about. That's all we can do as practitioners, is put ourselves out there. So let me be who I am. And I know for many people it won't work. And for those that do, then that's my tribe. That's where I can provide value.
Daryl, there is one thing I want to talk with you towards the end of our conversation. You have been a guest of honor to the Berlin Change Days some years ago. What was your observation? How would you describe the Change Days experience?
Oh, that's a pleasure to talk about. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, it's now dated. I don't know. It's been a couple of years, a few years, Holger, since I got to be there. But I keep up with, as best I can, virtually, with the I would say the ecosystem that I felt there. It seems like that you've been able to invite people in to replicate and expand this ecosystem that I experienced there. And what I'm talking about is that I don't think you pulled people in. I think you gave people an excuse to pull themselves in by articulating a different gathering. You kind of talk about it. It's the anti-conference. It's not going to be your normal way of relating to each other. And my experience was that got reflected in certainly the quality of the people who came. I felt like there was a very generous environment where people were coming and saying, I don't have the answer, but I've got some things I've learned that I would love to share with others. So it was informative, and there were people that clearly made declarative statements about what had become true for them. But there wasn't this, here is the answer for you. And I very much appreciated that. That environment what it does is, to me, it provides a space for mastery development. First of all, I don't think when we create space, we don't dictate what happens in that space. We create an opportunity for it to be used however it's going to be used. And so the key is create the space and then invite people in there that are at least likely to get creative about how to use it. And that's, you did. You created the space, you allowed people to invite themselves in, and then that creative mix just seemed to kind of take on a life of its own. So rather than, yes, you gave birth to the space, but when I was there, it didn't seem to be owned by you. It was guided by you, but it really seemed to be owned by the community that had come there, and they began to forge their own direction in it.
Thank you so much for this nice description. I'm very honored and humbled. And the good news is there is now not only Berlin Change Days. There's also since last year Toronto Change Days.
Yeah,
This year you can go to Berlin Change Days early November and to Toronto Change Days mid-November, or to both. And the next move, because there's really a structure behind it. It was interesting because in Toronto, when we did it the first time, and I was really not pulling strings, I was just observing it, the same patterns did emerge because there is a structure behind this craziness. So what we are trying to do now is to bring it into organizations as a kind of kick-off event for organizations who want to embrace change and want to nurture their practitioners. Daryl, I want to close by reading one of my favorite poems to you, because I never did that in a podcast before, because it's so important for me, and I learned it from my teacher, Stephen Gilligan, and I think it fits so well to what you're saying and to what you said in one of your books, which is Don't Get Back to Sleep. So it's the poem by Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, and let me recite it. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the door sill where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. Daryl, thank you so much for this wonderful hour, and I want to go on and on and on because we just started to get warm. I really enjoy talking to you all the time. Thanks for being such an incredible role model for me and for many, many other people. Thanks for showing up. I'm in deep admiration for who you are and what you have done for our field.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Holger, and for creating this space. You know, for you at a minimum. I don't know about your listeners. At a minimum, I've enjoyed this time, and hopefully it's valuable for them. And you know, the icing on the cake is this. You know, this piece you just read from Rumi that I had not seen. I haven't read that before. I would absolutely that speaks to my heart. So thank you for that gift. I really appreciate it. You make me.